Welcome everyone. Welcome to everyone who's at their first Tech Leadership Meetup. It's good to have you here. And for everyone who is returning from and has been with us before, welcome back. Just going to start off with a couple of house rules that we just have, just to make you aware of. And then I'll do a few intro shares, and then we'll get started with our speaker. So from the house rules side, just as a note, please note that we'll be recording this event and that we may upload the video on YouTube post the meetup. So by staying on the Zoom call, you do agree that you're okay with potentially being seen in the upload. If you don't want to be seen, please switch off your camera or send a message to the organizers. That's Benny, Roberto, or myself. Please keep yourself on mute during the presentation so that any background noise doesn't filter into the speaker's talk. If you want to ask a question, please type it in the chat. We'll curate these questions at the end of the session and ask the speaker to answer the questions. So please just message one of the co-hosts again if you have any problems with sending your questions, but you can just freely drop them in the chat as the talk goes along. And then finally, the rule of 2 feet applies. So if you need to head off, please feel free to head off. I would love to see you stay for the entire time, but we do understand that there are sometimes more pressing things that you need to get to. All right, cool. Then a couple of intro things before we move on to the speaker. First off, we'd just like to thank our official meetup sponsors, Peach Payments, for supporting our community. Peach Payments make online commerce and digital payment acceptance easier and more accessible across Africa. If this is something that's of interest to you, or you'd like to know more about it, you can visit peachpayments.com to check them out. For those that are new or those that have been before and are not part of our newsletter yet, we have a Tech Leadership newsletter which shares curated links that we've found over the month that have useful content for technology leaders. And it's all about learning and growing and sharing good content with each other. This was the last one that went out last month. So this is just an example of what the newsletter looks like. And as I said, it's just a shared list of curated tech leadership content. I'll be sharing, post this intro, I'll be sharing a link to the newsletter. If you're interested, then you can sign up there by just sharing your email. We also have a Twitter account, Tech Leadership X. And on this, we also share curated links of technology leadership content. We post a link once a day, generally, and we also share upcoming meetups and any details around what activities we're doing. So similarly, you'll find, if you scroll down, links from each day just about interesting things about tech leadership. So if you are on Twitter and this is interesting to you, you can follow Tech Leadership X. And then to the exciting stuff for today. So we are excited to have our speaker, Kruger. He's the CTO of Snapscan, and he's going to be sharing some technology leadership content with us today. The title of his talk is 0 to 60 in 5 seconds, from startup to scale up. And with that, I will hand over to Kurt to take over from here.
How's it, guys? Thanks so much for the intro. Just give me 1 second and just share my screen. Cool. So 0 to 60 in 5, from startup to scale up. So just a little bit of background on me. I'm not a household name yet, but I am made of like 50% coffee and 50% donuts. I've got a very busy, very smart 4-year-old who loves Minecraft. So that keeps him busy for like half of the day. The other half of the day, I typically don't eat very well. So donuts and fried food are like a staple diet for me. But more importantly, like I've been in tech for quite a while now, 16 plus years. And I've been in leadership roles for about 7 of those. The bad news is that I'm still winging it, but don't tell anyone. So just a little bit more about my startup background. So I've worked for about 7 companies now. 5 of them are startups. And they've been pretty varied. So I've worked at a few corporates as well. And those have mainly been like fairly short stints. But otherwise, like my entire career has been based around startups. The very first one was a startup called CAS, Complex Adaptive Systems. We were one of the first AI startups in South Africa, and they went bust. That is a pretty terrible story, which I will say for another day. And then the next startup I joined quite a bit later was Yoko. Yeah, you might have heard of them. And they made headlines again earlier this week. And then I moved over to Jumo, another fintech. You'll see that I like companies with like 3 and 4 letter names. So I left Jumo shortly after we managed to do another funding round of about 70 million US. And then I joined Cape, which was a much smaller company doing IoT things. So like a wild pivot from fintech to something completely different. And then I left that company about a year after it got acquired. And then the last startup that I've been involved in is Snapscan, fintech again. But I'll explain a little bit more about my journey there a little bit later. I think the biggest takeaway for me from all of these is that in some way, shape, or form, I've failed to support the scale-up processes at all of these companies. I think we got some things right, but for the most part, it's been some really hard learnings mixed in with a bunch of failures. So you guys might have heard of someone called Reid Hoffman, pretty popular guy, ex-PayPal, ex-LinkedIn, and he wrote a book about blitzscaling. And in this book, one of the famous quotes goes, "The only time that it makes sense to blitzscale is when you have determined that speed into the market is the critical strategy to achieve massive outcomes." Whether or not this holds true for your company is, I think, entirely up to you and the vision that you've laid out. I do agree with it to a certain extent, in that to kind of reach the market that you intend, you do need to move fast. But blitzscaling isn't necessarily the best way to get there. So with that word of wisdom, let's take a step back and define what this actually means. Because I think for most people, startup and scale up are kind of nebulous concepts where, much like 90% of the information on the internet, this is 100% my interpretation of what these two things mean. And again, it's purely based on my experiences. So if we were to define a startup, like these are the 4 key things that I think comes to mind. So there's this idea of a startup being a new company, not necessarily new in terms of age, but new in terms of being young and immature. So the company is still finding its feet. You're still working on figuring out the processes and finding the people that kind of meet the demands of your company. In that same vein, you're also fighting for survival. So you're trying to find a repeatable revenue stream, or otherwise you definitely risk the chance of dying. You're also in this exploration phase. So you're trying to turn over every rock to see if your product fits a need. You're essentially trying to find product market fit. And at the same time, there's also a level of chaos, right? So people who work at startups and do well at startups are generally okay with instability and constantly changing scenery. Now, having said this, I think you can still be a startup even if you grow year on year, because if you lack scalable growth, you will never reach the kind of critical mass that you need to reach to become a company that can grow larger than just having a single product or feature, or even just a single cohort of users. And I think Snapscan is actually a great example of this. So Snapscan is 8 or 9 years old now, depending on who you ask. And we had major successes as like one of the first QR payments locally. And we've grown year on year, every single year. But pre-2020, we didn't really have a viable scalable model, right? So everything was payments based and everything was kind of based on card not present. And if you look at what's happened in the market recently, we've got at least 3 competitors that are as big as we are. And so I highlight that the pre-2020 in this message, because it is the time when we started to think beyond just QR payments. And that's something I'll touch on a little bit later. Now, if we look at a scaler, again, these 4 things come to mind. So we think of success. So you found scalable, repeatable revenue streams. You kind of smooth the your OpEx and your CapEx. You know exactly where you're headed, right? We think of market fit. So your product solves a need and it's found large uptake. You have a reliable user base who uses you on a daily basis. We also think that scale-ups tend to be more mature. So you know who you are, you have a solid identity, you found the people and processes to kind of match what you're building. And then I think there's still an element of chaos in this, but this time it's more organized chaos. So things kind of just work, right? You've sorted out your processes, you've sorted out your people, and even though new competitors might spring up or the landscape might change in terms of legal requirements, and you still need to drive subsequent funding rounds, things are just that much easier because you have those processes and people in place. Now, what typically sparks that change from going from a startup to a scaler? And in my mind, it's kind of one of 2 things. The first one is always the first prize for me. It's where you strike gold with your business model and you kind of grow systematically. And the second option really is to find a big round of funding that just allows you to brute force your approach and just expand, either into other products or other markets. And yeah, obviously funding comes with some strings. So that'll always be second prize for me. Now, why do these definitions matter? I think the definitions are useful to allow you to measure your experience and determine where you are in your journey. I think it's a great way to identify the challenges that you'll face next. And I kind of just started to think about how to prep for these. Okay, so the 4 stages of chaos. So this is essentially when you've started thinking about scale, right? So it starts off with a level of comfort. So you're working at a startup, and in our case, you'd either be leading a team or you'd be leading multiple teams, or you're heading up the whole shebang. And things are going great. You know, you've got your processes waxed, your team is working effectively, and you're chipping away at some kind of achievable roadmap. But then suddenly a new challenge appears, and you know, you've been successful, and so you do develop a target on your back, and there will be new people who try to imitate what you've done. And so this will obviously threaten your place in the market, because first mover advantage isn't always a big advantage. And once the new challenge is in place and they have something once they've released something to the market, this can lead to panic. You know, so you realize that you need to move up into a new gear, and you start wondering how you're going to keep that competitive advantage. And so we move on to the last stage, and this is kind of where you turn to your exco, where you turn to your board, and you hear the words, "We're going to look for funding so we can scale." Again, like I said, funding is great. No one will turn down more money, but if you're not ready for it, if you're not ready for the changes that kind of funding and growth brings, things can go very, very wrong. And so you've gone through these 4 stages. What does this mean for you? Where are you headed next? And the answer usually is probably towards a Series B or Series C round of funding. And that means lots and lots and lots of money. So if you close that big round of funding, this money will generally go towards expansion. But money also always comes with some kind of strings, right? It can be explicit or implicit. Explicit in that funding will come usually in gated tranches. And so your investors are going to need you to show kind of proof of life of your growth. And this could be in the form of headcount, because everybody knows that extra bums in seats means that you get things to market faster. It could be new products or feature releases, or it could be expansion into new markets. And this is that last one is particularly important to investors in the fintech space. The implicit kind of strings that come attached to this is that everything is going to change for you, and everything is going to change very fast. So everything from hiring and roadmaps to goal setting, performance management, the things you've been accustomed to, it's all going to be flipped on their head. And also, if you get this gift, you're probably my age. This is a gift from the Mary Tyler Moore Show from the 1970s. So yeah, pretty old. Okay, another quote. So Deepak Chopra, again, very, very popular. He's an author, and one of the quotes, and I am definitely quoting him out of context here, but he said, all great changes are preceded by chaos. And so, like I said, the sentiment behind the original message doesn't quite match the situation that we're talking about, but taking out of context, it perfectly summarizes scale-ups. Like if you can weather the storm, if you can weather all of that change, you'll come out on the other side with invaluable experience and a scale-up that will probably win. Okay, so change comes at you very fast. And what I'd like to focus on today is kind of the four aspects of change that you're going to need to manage. And so these are basically a roadmap, hiring, structure, and process. Okay, so if we look at roadmap, if you get the funding, obviously the tranches that are going to be paid out are going to be based on you actually hitting some kind of milestones. And the roadmap that you have is necessarily going to change to accommodate these new milestones, as well as the new direction that your investors are going to be expecting of you. And again, like I said, this might be expanding to new markets or releasing new products, or even just targeting completely different cohorts. So if you think of a fintech, for example, like Apple Pay, so Apple obviously high value brand, and the people who can afford Apple generally are upwardly mobile. So the investors might expect you to start targeting people in the LSM market, right? If you look at hiring, would you be able to execute the roadmap with your current headcount? I'm guessing probably not, and that's probably what your investors are also thinking. The catch-22 here, though, is once you have the money, does the market even know about you? Like, do you have an employee forward brand? And if not, you're going to have to figure out that piece while you're hiring. You'll need more hands to get the job done, obviously. And your investors will expect you to show that you're serious about hiring, because, again, they fully expect that more bums and seats is going to translate into more output. And now your first inclination will be to hire quickly, because every second is precious, right? The longer you wait, the longer it takes to onboard new people, the longer it takes to get plans approved, the longer it takes to actually get the product to market. And I'll dive a bit deeper into this a little bit later. If we look at structure, the extra headcounts and kind of the rebound roadmap means you're probably going to have to put more structure in place as well. So for tech leads, if you're leading a single team, you'll probably go from a pizza-sized team to a multi-pizza team or multiple pizza-sized teams. Your focus is probably going to change from like business as usual stuff. So just making sure that the roadmap that's been laid out for you is being executed, to actually picking up some of the leadership around actually establishing that the roadmap for your particular teams. And so this also means that you'll probably do less coding, you'll do less architecting, and you'll probably focus more on vision and alignment. And this is something that I've spoken about in some of my other talks as well. When we look at processes, I think one of I've done a bunch of like leadership training programs through the various companies that I've worked with, and one of the big messages that has come out of every single one of those is that the way you communicate, the way your company communicates, essentially determines how you build products, and that in turn is a good proxy for how successful you'll be. So if you struggle to communicate effectively, like inter and intra-team, you're likely going to struggle to get the right products to the market efficiently. Now, for most startups, at some point, you would have skimmed on some of your processes, right? So to just get something into the market. And it's likely that those processes aren't going to work anymore. If you had spreadsheets that you manually like copy pasting things into and then sharing over email, and then somehow like importing into some other system, that's probably not going to scale. Like throw it in the trash and build it from scratch. So again, like things that work well for a 10-person company won't scale to a 20-person company, and that definitely won't scale to a 100-person company. So it's very important to keep in mind that scale is key, like scale across everything, scale across your roadmap, your hiring structure and processes. Okay, so those are kind of the areas that are going to change really fast for you. Story time. So this talk, I actually wanted to just be a chance for me to share some of my learnings at some of the biggest startups that I've been at. It's not a lecture, and apologies if it comes across as one. I don't know what I don't know. I think the biggest learning from year is that I actually have more questions than answers. But I have been lucky to go through this process a few times, trying to go from a startup to a scale-up. And I think my time at Snapscan has been the most successful so far. Okay, let's dive straight in. So company A, I've tried to keep these as anonymous as possible. It's company A. So I joined when the dev team was around 24 people, and this was across 3 different countries. So I joined as an architect, not in any kind of leadership role, well, traditional tech leadership role. But I realized in the first few months that I had joined that the team needed some kind of guidance and leadership, right? So senior management was just too far removed from the daily activities of the different dev teams. And so I had a few tough conversations about potentially moving into that kind of role. And eventually I made the switch. And as soon as I made the switch, I instantly inherited 15 devs with another 2 outside of the country. And that was a very rough crash course, but we had a really great senior leadership team in place, and so that kind of formed the basis of my leadership career as such. And over the next 2 years, we racked up a significant amount of funding, and we kind of grew the engineering function to about 100 people across the three different countries. We've also established like various other functions within the engineering team that never existed before. So we went from having essentially just devs to having devs, DevOps, agile, quality engineers, the whole shebang. And again, one of the big learnings that I took from this once I left the company was that I hit every obvious branch in the bad manager tree. So what went wrong? So if we look at the roadmap, with every round of funding that we managed to unlock, the roadmap would change. And so the vision always remained the same. The vision was to serve the unbanked, the unbanked, but the roadmap would just change constantly. So the focus was on financial products, so savings, loans, things like rent to own. And with every product came increased complexity. So we decided to change tack, slow down, and focus on kind of the core competencies. We looked at core services, products, and internal tooling. And we made a lot of mistakes here. Like it sounds great in theory, trying to break things down to individual domains and give people autonomy over those. But really, we made a ton of mistakes. I think first and foremost, it was not having clarity on what the platform vision was. So for whatever reason, the platform vision was eventually pulled more into the product and architecture roadmaps and further away from engineering. And so engineering slowly over time became disempowered to own the domains that they were working in. And along with that, because we didn't have that kind of clarity, it also meant that we couldn't plan far enough ahead. So at any given time, we were only a month or 2 ahead of the rest of the engineering team. And that meant that we were trading lots and lots of water. Now, the constant pivoting to the next most important thing. When you're looking for funding, you kind of need to make your vision palatable to the investors. Sometimes pivoting is good if you're not finding market fit for the things that you already have. But if you're chasing something just to get funding, you should probably start asking a few questions. And related to this story, like I can recall a time when our COO set up some time with me to go over why one of the core teams was refactoring some legacy code and not working on a product that we were trying to launch to get more funding. And the short answer was that we couldn't build new things until this like internal investment work was finished. And so these are the kinds of conversations that you're going to start having if you're not having them now already. And you're going to have to stand up for your teams because sometimes it's better to just slow down before you speed up. Hiring. We definitely hired too fast. So again, with every round of funding, there would be an expectation that we hire more people. A bigger headcount obviously looks good to investors on paper because it means that you're applying the funding well with a view to scaling out your efficiency. So I personally did a few hundred interviews, like across screening interviews, technical, cultural, and all of our interviewers just got burnt out. They were in the same space as me. A small team trying to triple the size of our dev teams. And so everybody was just constantly interviewing. And when we were constantly interviewing, we were also just hiring way too fast. So we weren't intentional about the culture we wanted to cultivate. So the team that we built was young, kind of homogenous. And over time, we actually started making concessions to meet targets that had been set by senior management. And it's I think the key takeaway from this one is that it's important to figure out what the identity is, not just for your company, but for each of your teams. Like each of your teams is very different. Each of your teams is going to have different behavior sets. Each of them is going to have different skill sets, and there are going to be gaps for each of these. And if you don't know what you're hiring for, you're probably going to make the wrong hires. A dev isn't a dev. Like it needs to be fit for purpose. And so that's the mistake that we fell into. We ended up making a few really bad hires, and it took too long to cut them loose. I think for various reasons that we can go into in a different talk. Some candidates just interviewed extremely well, very polished, CVs look great, gave textbook answers, but once they were hired, we slowly realized that they just ended up derailing any kind of progress that we were making elsewhere. And so I've come to learn that every hire you make is a little bit of a gamble. And I like to think that over time you build up a good instinct about what the candidate, how the candidate is going to fare inside your kind of org. But like a good gambler, you also need to know when to cash in your chips. A bad hire during your growth phase can be disastrous, and it really can set you back a few months. Structure. Again, I think this is the case for most startups where you kind of play it fast and loose. There's no real structure when you start off. Everybody kind of does everything, and that's great because you tend to be quite efficient, maybe not the most effective. But if you leave putting in structure too late, it really does become a case of something being too little, too late. So one of the things that we tried to do from the get-go was we tried to get people to buy into the idea of responsibilities rather than titles. And we thought that we could get people to buy into this principle, and we were wrong. So there's definite value to a model like Netflix uses, in that it encourages inclusion and collaboration. But I don't think the local market is ready for it. And we were kind of doing a disservice to our people by not making it clear what position everybody played on the pitch. And this is especially true for younger teams, where people are still trying to find out who they are, like what kind of dev they are, where they want to focus. And so then eventually we kind of caved and we said, okay, let's go back to titles, let's go back to competencies, let's draw out growth plans, let's draw out performance management plans. But it was, again, too little, too late. So once we'd done this, like the salaries and the titles weren't aligned because we didn't have titles, we didn't have salary bands previously. And so we couldn't really undo the bad impressions that we had made on some of the tenured devs because people started chasing title rather than responsibility. We also then tried to introduce more engineering managers, right? So I was the first one there, and the role was not clear. I I think at one point we required the engineering managers to have recent coding skills. And then by the end of it, we just said, nope, engineering managers aren't going to touch code in any case. So there's no need for them to be able to code. And this kind of disparate view it breaks the trust that you've been trying to build up between the engineers and these managers that you're trying to bring in. And something similar happened once we tried to introduce other functions into the engineering team. So agile leads and quality engineers. We hired a bunch of them and we tried to move to a fully agile and quality driven organization. But again, the team was too young. They had never experienced this before, and it took too long to get buy-in. And so we lost valuable time on countless meetings, just trying to get this buy-in. And then something else that we also got wrong in terms of structure is that we split responsibilities amongst the leadership team. So like I said, we had engineering managers, we had architects, agile leads, we had senior engineers who kind of also served as team leads. Then we had QAs. So there was a lot of overlap in responsibilities, not a lot of clarity in who owned which piece. And so again, we got into this, we got into a rut of just treading water and trying to figure out, or just waiting for somebody to make a decision. And then process. So I was trying to think of a way to describe it succinctly. And I think too business focused is probably the most apt. And let me explain. So the products we were building were all USSD driven, right? So there was very low smartphone penetration in the markets that we were in. And so the interactions needed to be simple by design. The go-to-market process focused heavily on the needs of the product department, and also this insane drive to just keep funding things, and less so on the needs of the customer as well as the engineering departments. So products would often only go through like user and behavior testing after they'd gone through a full build cycle, and the build cycles were typically like 3 to 9 months long. And like this is for anybody in a product first organization, like this is extremely dangerous, because it means that you don't really know whether or not you're building the right thing. You're not sure if you're building the right thing at the right time. And there's no way to then measure it, because there's no way for you to set up metrics if you haven't spoken to anyone. Sure, you can guess at the metrics, but you're probably going to be wrong. And then the last piece here in terms of process is that like tech debt was almost never prioritized. And over time, the architects kind of drifted over to the product team rather than staying in engineering, since that's where most of the interesting conversations happen. Like I mentioned earlier, like everything slowly started drifting towards product, and product kind of owned that entire space. And this broke the feedback loop that was meant to safeguard engineering and the stability of the platform. And this is exactly how it played out on a few occasions, where the products that were built would actually just break because it couldn't scale and because it didn't really meet the customer needs. So where are they now? Unfortunately, again, like most startups going into that the scale up phase, they did go through a significant round of retrenchments. They are still grinding away for more funding, again, as is the case with most scale-ups. The positive, though, is that they've rebranded as being a tech-forward company now. And I think this is essential given the history of the company. So again, they've decided to be more tech-forward and slow down to speed up. And what they've managed to do over the last few years is they've managed to build out a comprehensive product suite that is scalable and has a scalable market as well, with reliable revenue. So they're finally on a very good, they're in a very good space. Company B. So this was a much smaller company. So when I joined as an engineering manager again. The entire dev team was 5 people. And the founders decided that they needed some more leadership. So they had never really been in leadership roles before. They tended to focus more on the tech and more on the product side of things, as opposed to trying to grow the different teams that they led. And so in this time, we managed to grow the engineering team to about 14 people. I know it doesn't sound like much. The entire company more than doubled in headcount. And it was an interesting experience. But again, even though I consider this more of a success than the previous company that I was with, I still hit like a bunch of branches in the bad manager tree. And so again, what went wrong here? So in terms of the roadmap, this is definitely a case of he who shouts the loudest gets the shiny feature. So the parent company kind of bought the product because it fit quite neatly into the suite of things that they were trying to offer customers. But they also just had no idea what to do with it in terms of the product evolution. And so again, priorities would change wildly from month to month, depending on which big dollar customer shouted the loudest. So even though this isn't strictly related to funding, it is still related to the idea that the ultimate like revenue drives what you should be building. Now, everyone kind of got suckered into chasing instant gratification, right? So if you reach your sales targets, you get things, rather than trying to solve a broader user need and laying out the road before starting to build. And the reason why this was so appealing to everyone was because when you reach your sales targets, it meant big bonuses. And that also came with the promise of infinite hiring, right? So if your team manages to reach sales of 26 million US, you can have a blank check and hire as many devs as you want. And this sounded great. But neither of these things were really realized despite hitting targets. And so it was kind of a lose-lose situation monetarily and kind of tech-wise. And this was demoralizing for the team, because you're essentially grinding away on things that don't really scale, in the hopes that you land a big fish. And when you don't land the big fish, or you do land the big fish, you still don't get to scale out your team so that you can start focusing on like future-facing things. And so the team tried to take ownership of some kind of internal roadmap, but again, it was just never given priority because sales always trumped the platform. Now, in terms of hiring, I think this is a very unique case because often when you go from startup to scale up, your processes do change. But it's very rarely that you will find a company that moves straight into like these bloated corporate processes. Anyway, so remember the catch-22 that I mentioned earlier, where you have the money, but does the market know about you? And this was the case with this company. Nobody knew who we were, and nobody cared, to be honest. We were tiny, and we were an unknown team. None of the local superstars were there, with a product that wasn't even used locally, and a leadership team with no social media footprint. So we really were literally a ghost startup. And so we started a branding drive. Like we sponsored and attended conferences. We had our engineers present at conferences. We introduced lunch and learn sessions, and we invited guest speakers. We introduced an internship program and pitched our company at various open days. But at the same time, we also really had no formal interview process. It was super casual, and the questions were different every time. So there was no way that you could, gauge different people against each other. And so while we were trying to go on this whole branding drive, we also started to spend more time formalizing all of this stuff. We came up with sales pitches for screening calls. We came up with take-home assessments with different worked examples going by experience level. We fleshed out in-person interviews with standardized problem sets that could be tailored up or down, given the candidate experience and how the candidate was faring in the interview. But even though we were dealing with a level of scale that most local startups probably will never see, we struggled to hire because we were also unrealistic about the kind of work that the potential candidates would do. So even though some of the core services within the platform required in-depth knowledge of how to massively scale distributed systems, most of the platform was your typical crowd platform. And so we kind of interviewed and we canvassed and we interviewed with very little to show for it, simply because we focused on the wrong kinds of candidates. And at the same time, we were trying to do all of these things, and then also just get work done. So just like keep crunching away at writing code to try to get one of those billion-dollar companies to sign up with us. And then we look at what went wrong in the processes. I wrote there, don't be a knee jerk. So even though there was very little process initially, which is kind of okay again for most early age startups, it was extremely little process. So there were boards where you could kind of track where some of the larger projects were, but we also only notionally adopted agile practices. So there was a daily stand-up, but there was also no way to track work and no way to reliably plan ahead. One-on-ones were conducted, but we never translated into actionable ideas. And we definitely didn't take out as a leadership group as much time as we could to bed down our desired processes. And again, this is because everybody was chasing that final target, that final goal. And this kind of led to a lot of unhappiness in the teams. And that unhappiness turned into knee-jerk reactions, which turned into non-ideal processes, which would inevitably have to be reworked a month or two down the line. And I think what compounded this was probably the fact that the engineer managers, and I was one of them, never quite gelled with the senior leadership on very fundamental things, right? We never figured out the best way to run the company. Like, what is our identity? Where are we headed? What is the culture that we're trying to build? And I think after the acquisition, we also then started to slowly onboard the parent company's programs. And so we essentially went from having very little process to being inundated with lots of processes. And suddenly getting something done would take weeks or months due to bureaucracy, whereas previously it would just take a few days because you could do whatever you wanted. And again, this isn't necessarily a bad thing, but we as the engineering managers and the leadership team didn't handle that transition well. And we didn't take the time to get training on the new systems and then share that knowledge amongst our teams. So where are they now? So they're still chasing whales. And one day I'm pretty sure that they will land one of the big ones. But there's still no long-term vision for what the product needs to become. They are still pandering to the client or the potential client who shouts the loudest and waves the biggest check around. Now, the founding team has moved on, and that kind of does leave an extremely talented team. And these are some of the best that I've worked with in my shortish career. But it leaves them with a kind of a rudderless ship, but also this massive corporate backing, which is very confusing. So they have endless potential, but they really just need someone to harness the vision of where the company is headed. Now, what about Snapscan? So again, and this seems to happen at every company that I joined. When I joined Snapscan, I joined a small dev team of about three engineers. So far, we've managed to grow the team to about 17. We've grown the entire company from 20 to 50 people during lockdown. And we fail at many things. Like you don't grow a company that fast remotely and retain your culture 100%. We've made lots of missteps, but I think we're building towards something special. And my ending year is definitely still unwritten. Now, what are the things that I've learned over the last few years? And I think there's like 4 or 5 things that I'd like to touch on very briefly. The very first thing is plan ahead. Vision first, strategy second. When your team understands where you're headed, it's easier for them to identify the route to get there. And it's easier for them to believe in what they're doing. And if they believe in what they're doing, they're going to do great work. So if you hire smart people, sell them on the dream and then get out of the way so they can execute. Get buy-in. Again, everybody needs to be on board. Everybody needs to be on board with your identity, with your strategy, and with the vision for the business. If they're not, they likely won't operate at their best, and that's a big disservice to them and your plans. Slow down to speed up, and this is something that I've mentioned throughout this talk now. I think everybody needs to realize that it's okay to slow down before you speed up. Like throwing more devs at a problem doesn't make it go any faster. It's super important that you figure things out before you go full steam ahead. Because the worst thing you can do is to put all of your pieces in play and only then start to think about how they all work together. It's, yeah, in my experience, just leads to chaos. Culture, nurture over nature. And what I mean by this is that by the time you start thinking about becoming a scale-up, you kind of need to know what works and what doesn't work for your team. You need to know what the gaps are. You need to know the strengths of your team. And you need to be able to translate that into a culture that you can foster. And you kind of need to nurture it every single day, and you need to be intentional about it. Because if you don't, like I said earlier, like a single bad hire can have a massive impact on the culture that you're trying to build. And then something that might be a little contentious, especially for scale-ups, and especially for what I mentioned earlier, is hire slow, fire fast. And this is probably contrary to like most books that you'll read about scale-ups. I think the growth phase isn't a good fit for everyone. Doubling or tripling the size of your team is going to change your culture. Even if it just changes a little bit, even a small nudge will have a big impact throughout your team. So it's important that you hire intentionally and that you back your employees all the way. But at the same time, if someone is a poor fit, you're going to need to be candid about their performance. Also, you're going to inherit people that just don't like the direction that the company is taking. And that's okay. Like, it can be scary having to deal with all of this change. And so you kind of need to be okay with people leaving as well, because they just don't like where you're headed. And then lastly is be open and honest. So obviously things are going to change fast. You're going to make mistakes. You're probably going to make lots of them, at least if you're like me. It's super important that you are open and honest about this. You need to encourage feedback, because when you get feedback, you can actually action things, you can fix things. Your people are your lifeblood, and so you need to treat them as such. So when your people speak, you need to listen. Yeah, you need to listen to understand, and then you need to act on it. And that's it. Thanks, everyone.
All right. Thanks a lot, Kurt, for the talk. Yeah, it was really, really insightful. I like the way you structured it with all the chaos you went through, and then summarizing it in the end with all the lessons you've gathered from all the chaos you've gone through at each of those companies. I think it aligns with that. I think that quote you shared where it talks about chaos, and then after all the chaos, there's always something at the end for you. So yeah, no, thanks a lot. I'm just conscious of time, and there were quite a lot of questions that came through. So just want to jump into a couple of questions from the audience. And then we can address a few of the questions, and then we can wrap up just around 7 there. Benny and Roberto, I hope you guys are all right with me just skipping yours for now and jumping from some of the questions from the audience. I think you guys are the first two, but I know also going to chat with Kurt a little bit after. So perhaps let's start with the first question was around when you're talking about bad hires. And I think the question is, what qualifies as a bad hire?
So the specific cases that I tried to point out in the talk is people who are a great fit on paper. So they had the qualifications, they worked at reputable companies, they interviewed really well, they gave really good answers. And then as soon as we brought them in, they showed a completely different side of themselves. So rather than trying to fit into the kind of open and honest culture that we were trying to build, they kind of put up walls between different teams. They put up walls between different departments. For lack of a better term, I think like little fiefdoms started popping up around them. And I suspect it's probably a residual behavior that was learned at other companies. Sometimes like big companies tend tends to happen in some of the bigger corporates. And that's something that we didn't gauge well enough during the interview process. And so what it often meant that it meant to fall us between devs and these people. It would lead to lower output from the dev team. It would lead to, again, constantly treading water, having meetings about meetings about meetings, rather than trying to plot a course forward and then trying to execute on that. And that's kind of how the bad hires showed up in a few of the companies that I was at.
All right, cool. Thank you. The next one's from Colin. Could you elaborate on what being intentional about the culture you're trying to cultivate means?
So this is really something that's become incredibly important for me at Snapscan. And so if you listen to any of my other talks before, you'd know that I am less empathetic than I would like to be. And so I know that this is something that this is a behavior that I lack. And so I've tried to surround myself with people who are empathetic and people who really understand what it means to build out a culture. And so I think that's one of the pieces of it, right? Is to make sure that you surround yourself with people who kind of complement you, and then leaning on them to help identify like what makes a good culture for your current situation. And it could be something as simple as, for example, at Snapscan, we have this unlimited leave policy. And obviously people are scared to take leave because if you're the only one who's taking leave, or if you're the only one who's taking like big chunks of leave, you probably think that it looks bad. And so like one of the things we've tried to change over the last few months is just to show that it's okay to take leave. And if the leadership team isn't taking leave, isn't making use of this unlimited leave, then it probably means that the rest of the company also can't. And so we've started essentially forcing each other to take leave, to show people that, hey, it's okay to take leave, it's healthy. Like we need to prioritize your mental and physical health first. And so I think it starts with like, even from the like smallest things, like just showing people that it's okay to take leave, or showing people that they can have access to learning materials like at the company's expense, to the bigger things, which is like just making sure that you find people who fill the gaps that you don't have, or that you have. Sorry.
Okay, cool. Thanks again. Yeah, I think the unlimited leave one is worthy of a talk as a topic.
Yeah, that's exactly what we've done as well. Minimum amounts of days that we want you to take.
Yeah. Cool. And then there's one from Steve, which you might have sort of answered in your Snapscan slide, but then might be worth adding anything more. So the question is, how big is Snapscan's product, and how big is the engineering function?
What do you mean by Snapscan's product?
Steve, if you good to unmute and maybe.
I meant actually the size of the product and engineering teams or functions as a whole.
Right. We are super tiny. So engineering is currently 17 people, and product is 5 people and growing. So we're hoping to double the size of the teams by early next year. So super tiny is the answer.
All right. There were 3 questions from Robin. I'm gonna pick the first one because I think we do have a few more. So from Robin, it's, how did your early engineers find their place in the scale-up? Did you build a structure above them, distancing them from the founders, or were there cases where those early employees could find their place in leadership?
Robin, are you talking about Snapscan in particular, or any and all of the companies? Any? Okay. So I think I've been lucky enough to work at startups where the founders and the senior leadership teams have try to not distance themselves. So I think every single startup that I've worked at that has been successful, that's been kind of the main trait of the C-suite, is that they still try to get stuck in with some of the daily activities, not necessarily the business as usual work, but making sure that they understand like who's working for the company, what they're doing, how they fit into the bigger picture, having an open door policy, something as simple as just going for coffee with people like randomly. I think that it's been like building out the leadership functionalities inside the engineering teams that I've been at has been very different from company to company. Like I think Snapscan is the first place where I think we've managed to get it right. So we've tried to focus on identifying people internally who could move into those leadership roles, and then putting them on programs to grow them into those roles. And in cases where we haven't found people who wanted to move into those roles or who weren't ready to move into those roles, either looking again for like external people, or kind of rolling up multiple teams into one, and changing the role of the team lead to something like an engineering manager, with the idea that you still then be able to grow out tech and team leads within each of the domains from the talent that we have at the moment. And one of the first things I did after I joined was actually just trying to map that out into like some kind of career journey. So going through the different phases, and then the different kinds of competencies and behaviors that you need to show at each of those levels. And then also making space for people who don't want to move into some kind of like management role, because let's face it, like a lot of devs don't want to. A lot of devs want to be a domain expert, but they don't actually want to manage people, and that's completely fine. And so we've tried to cater for all of those things. We've tried to cater for like internal moves. We've tried to make space. We've tried to make space for people from other teams to move into engineering as well. So we've tried to cater for all of these things, and it's been a journey. Like it's taken us 2 years to get to the point where I think we're comfortable with the hierarchy that we have, the different kind of growth plans that we have, the competencies we expect from each of the levels and each of the types of roles. And so far, I think it's working. And I think I think all of that stuff has kind of played into not just the branding piece, but also the retention piece.
All right, thank you. We'll ask one more question from someone who hasn't had any question addressed, and then we'll start wrapping up from there. So this one's from David. It's, what was your trigger for knowing it was time to fold or move on to another company? How did you feel about the team you left behind?
So I think like every time I've left a company, it's been extremely emotional for me, because I tend to get very attached to the teams that I work with. I think there's two kind of things that would always push me from one company to the next, and that is, number one is when I am no longer a net positive for the company, and that could be due to just me not gelling with the rest of the leadership team. I don't think I've ever had any fights with the teams that I've led themselves, but I think so number one is definitely if I'm no longer a net positive. And secondly, if the issues at the company start filtering into my personal life, that's a big red flag for me.
All right. Thanks so much again, Kurt.
Thanks, guys.
I will come back to you for a final wrap up. Just want to do some meetup closing, and then we'll come back to say a final thank you. So just to wrap up from the meetup side, thanks again, everyone, for attending. We just want to say again, official thank you to our meetup sponsors, Peach Payments, for supporting our community. Peach Payments, as I said earlier, make online commerce and digital payment acceptance easier and more accessible all across Africa. And if this is something you're interested in, or your company is interested in using their service, you can go to peachpayments.com and check them out. And as I mentioned also earlier, we've got a tech leadership newsletter, and we'll be sending out an issue right after this meetup. You can access the links which I sent earlier, and they're also in the chat now. And if you want to receive that tech leadership newsletter, it's just a curated list of tech leadership content that is just helpful in our community sharing and educating each other. And we also have a Twitter account, if you're on Twitter, where we share, again, tech leadership oriented content, at least a link once a day of interesting content. So you can follow us at Tech Leadership X if you're interested in that. And then once again, just to say thank you to Kurt for the talk and coming to share all the lessons you've learned with our meetup community. As is customary from the tech leadership community, for each speaker who joins us, we offer a gift, a book of your choice. And Benny, that is sponsored by Benny's company, Matchbox Solutions. And Benny will be in touch to chat about which book you'd be interested in getting from us. So yeah, thanks again, Kurt, and thank you to everyone who's joined us for the first time and everyone who's been with the tech leadership community before and has joined us once again. We will all see you in a month for our next meetup. Cheers, everyone, and